RB Leipzig turned 17 this year, but how has a club that is still a teenager managed to compete in the Bundesliga for 10 years and have been able to qualify for Europe in every season they played in, apart from last year? So it's time to look at the story of RB Leipzig, obviously the team that is younger than most people probably watching this.
Und das ganze Stadion schreit: Ole, 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 ole. Leipziger Jungs sind unterwegs, rot-weiße Farben, wohin ich seh. Ole, 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 ole.
So the idea of a German football team with the links to Red Bull was the birth child of Red Bull owner Dieter Mateschitz. Mateschitz is the founder of Red Bull after he partnered with the original inventor of the drink, which comes from Thailand. And Mateschitz is now dead, but obviously he was the founder of Red Bull Sports as we know it today. So F1, football, cycling, in like the extreme sports as well. And he also did create a TV program known as Service TV, which has been used to promote populist and right-wing ideologies. And so the story begins in 2006 when Mateschitz and Red Bull began searching for a football club to invest in Germany. Obviously by this time they'd already done the same thing in Salzburg and in New York, and were looking to expand and have like a marquee team. And so they looked in Hamburg, Munich and Düsseldorf. And then following the advice from Franz Beckenbauer, who was a friend of Mateschitz, it was decided that they would invest in a club from Leipzig. Now Leipzig's two predominant clubs are Lokomotiv Leipzig and Sachsen Leipzig. Both are steeped in history in terms of East German football. Sachsen Leipzig used to be called Chemie Leipzig, but they were having financial difficulties. And because the latter was struggling financially, Red Bull planned to invest 50 million euros into the club and change the name to FC Red Bull Sachsen Leipzig. However, the DFB would veto the move when the club applied for a license, as well as on top of this, the fans of Sachsen Leipzig did not want the move to happen at all and protested it. After the failure in Leipzig, they then tried the same move in Hamburg with St. Pauli of all teams, Munich with 1860 and Düsseldorf with Fortuna Düsseldorf. The move for Fortuna Düsseldorf was a lot closer and the most advanced, but again, fan protests and the DFB vetoed the name of Red Bull Düsseldorf. It's going to become obvious soon because it could be used for advertising purposes. So in 2009, they would then head back to Leipzig to continue their search for a new team. But why Leipzig? Well, it had the Zentralstadion, which was one of the biggest in the country and had recently been built for the 2006 World Cup, but had no regular tenant. It also had a lot of potential to grow as a club because Leipzig is a very big city. And most importantly, they did not have a top flight team either. But what Red Bull realised is that it would be too much of a risk in general and financially to take on an existing big club. So they decided to start their own. This would also prove to be a problem, as it would mean that they would have to start at the very bottom of the German football pyramid in the Kreisliga. So they instead looked to buy a license from another club. That club will be SSV Markranstadt, who had a link to Red Bull, i.e. the person that helped broker the deal. Now the price of the license is said to be around 350,000 euros, and the Oberliga side would provide the basis of the early years of Leipzig, so the players, the head coach, and the youth teams which you needed to have the license. So on May 19th, 2009, Rasen Ballsport Leipzig were found, or RB Leipzig. Why are they called Rasen Ballsport? It means lawn ball sports, but obviously coincidentally the initials RB, it also means Red Bull, and so the use of Rasenball is a way to get around the advertising problem. And so the use of Rasen Ballsport ended up circumventing the rules of the DFB and the fact that they had their license vetoed or the proposed takeover of Düsseldorf vetoed because of the Red Bull aspect. So this RB Leipzig's goal was to make the Bundesliga within 8 years, and they would start in the 5th tier instead of right at the very bottom. First season was an immediate success. They won the Oberliga and gained promotion to the Regional Liga Nordost, which is the 4th tier. And during this season, they played for Markenstad in the stadium, and then at the end of this season and the promotion to the 4th tier, they would move to the Central Stadion, or what is now known as the Red Bull Arena, and it's like a 60,000 seater stadium. I think it's actually closer to 50. In the 4th tier, they would spend 3 seasons there, finishing 4th, 3rd, and then 1st, gaining promotion in 2012 to 13, beating Sportfreund Lotto in a playoff. But what was most important about this season was the appointment of Ralf Rangnick as sporting director. The former head coach would end up laying the foundations for not only Leipzig, but also Red Bull clubs going forward with the style of play, which everyone knows is Red Bull football. So that's the high-pressing, attacking style of play. This would also see the beginning of the development of their transfer policy with the signing of Yusuf Poulsen from Denmark, as well as a lesser-known midfielder by the name of Joshua Kimmich from Stuttgart's under-19. They would only spend 1 year in the Dritte Liga, or the 3rd division, and in 2013-14 they would gain immediate promotion to the Zweite Bundesliga, after finishing 2nd in the league behind Heidenheim. More players who would become protagonists over the years for Leipzig would join in the future. So in that summer, before they started in the Zweite Bundesliga, Emil Forsberg, Marcel Sabitzer, Lucas Klostermann and Marvin Komber all joined. Promotion to the Zweite Bundesliga also meant that they had to comply with DFL rules and not just DFB rules. And obviously this brought up several more problems when it comes to their links to Red Bull. So to grant Leipzig a license, the DFL set them 3 requirements. Change the crest, which coincidentally has 2 balls against one another, like over football, so they aren't linked to Red Bull, and also open up their membership. Now, why is the Leipzig membership not open to everyone like other Bundesliga clubs? Well, the way Leipzig have worked is they've circumvented the 50+1 rules of having 50% plus 1 vote fan ownership. They circumvented it by basically gaming the system, and you're only allowed to become, like, there's only a certain group of people who are allowed to be members of Leipzig, all of those working for Red Bull. So that means you have people in power making the decisions. So basically, with a normal club, you have the fans voting on like decisions, so who the president's going to be, whatever. Leipzig just have a bunch of executives making that decision normally. So it's a glorified version of like a board and making the decisions and where the club is going. And so people cannot become a member of Leipzig in the same way that you could have Borussia Dortmund, for example. And so they don't have things like AGMs or whatever. So Leipzig obviously complained about this and a compromise was reached surrounding the latter two. So to change the crest and to show they aren't linked to Red Bull, but they did not open the membership to the public. In the first season in the Zweite Bundesliga in 2014-15, they would finish 5th, meaning they had missed out on making it to the Bundesliga. So that summer, Rangnick would take charge for the next season while Leipzig solved their problem on the pitch with just throwing money at it. And they signed Davy Selke for a then Zweite Bundesliga record of €8 million, as well as the likes of Willi Orban, Peter Galacci and Marcel Haustenberg. On Selke, he's still 3rd in terms of biggest signing ever in the Zweite Bundesliga, with Nuremberg's signing of Stefan Zimas, as well as Stuttgart's signing of Silas, the only more expensive signings, but Silas was also 8 million, so joined 2nd for Selke. Obviously, throwing money at the problem worked. Leipzig finished 2nd, despite being in 1st place for most of the season. Instead, Freiburg would actually win the league, and Leipzig would end up 5 points behind them. But 7 years after Leipzig had been created, they were now a Bundesliga side. Rangnick would return to his role as sporting director for now, and he would be replaced by Ralf Hasenhüttl, who had made his name at Ingolstadt and taken them to the Bundesliga. In terms of their moves in the summer, it was obvious this team was not an ordinary promoted side. They spent €29.7 million on Naby Keita from sister club Red Bull Salzburg, which is going to be a relationship you see frequently used over the years. 23 million on Timo Werner from Stuttgart and 18 million on Dayot Upamecano from Salzburg too. And their impact was instant. And in their maiden Bundesliga season, they were on a 13-game unbeaten run, which even saw them top the table at one point. This run included wins against Dortmund, Leverkusen and Schalke. And after mounting what seemed like an unlikely title challenge, they would ultimately finish second, 15 points behind winners Bayern. The following season, they would finish 6th and qualify for the Europa League, but Hasenhüttl would leave at the end of the season. So Leipzig reacted by agreeing a deal with Hoffenheim head coach Julian Nagelsmann that he would become their head coach. But this would not take effect for another year. So Rangnick would then return to the dugout for another year, where he finished 3rd, as well as reaching the final of the DFB Pokal that season, where they would ultimately lose 3-0 to Bayern Munich. And then the club continued to make its mark in the transfer market, selling Naby Keita to Liverpool for 60 million, as well as buying the likes of Christopher Nkunku and Dani Olmo, which we'll get to later. In Nagelsmann's first season, it saw the club finish 3rd again, but the season was halted by COVID. But the pandemic helped them in the Champions League, as it allowed them to make it to the semi-finals due to the format of the competition switching to a one-game pure knockout one instead of the 2 legs. So this allowed them to beat Atletico Madrid in the quarter-final in Portugal before losing to PSG in the semis, in what was a somewhat close game as well. The next season would be Nagelsmann's final one, as they finished 2nd and made the Pokal final again, but again, this time they lost 4-1 to Borussia Dortmund. And Nagelsmann would end up joining Bayern Munich as their head coach for what was then a record fee for a manager. I think it was €50 million release clause. So Salzburg head coach Jesse March would be appointed as Nagelsmann's successor, but he would be dismissed pretty quickly, being replaced by Domenico Tedesco, who would rescue the season and lead the club to a 4th place finish, as well as a semi-final loss in the Europa League, and then another DFB Pokal final. However, this would be the first major moment for Leipzig, as this time, after 2 failed attempts losing in the final, they would get it over the line and win their first ever major trophy as a team, with a win against Freiburg on penalties following a 1-1 draw. Obviously, following that, you had the quite controversial picture of Kevin Campbell pouring Red Bull into the Pokal trophy. The next season, Tedesco would be sacked and replaced by former Salzburg head coach Marco Rose, who would lead Leipzig then to a 3rd and another Pokal win, so 2 times in a row. This time they beat Eintracht Frankfurt 2-0 in the final. A 4th place finish followed, then the next season Rose would be sacked as Leipzig finished 7th, their first time missing out in Europe since promotion. And in the young history of Leipzig, that season or that time in the Rose was probably their best opportunity at trying to win a trophy. In Rose's first season, there was a game right at the end of the campaign against Bayern Munich at the Allianz, where they beat them 2-1. That which should have been the transitional moment for Leipzig to go from, okay, we're fighting for top 4 to we're fighting for titles. But they didn't. And I think out of all the teams, it was the Marco Rose Leipzig that should have done a lot better than they actually did. I mean, finishing 4th and 7th is not good enough. But obviously what was only briefly mentioned was the fact that Leipzig when they first were created, they had an ambition of winning the Bundesliga. But that's really been put on the back burner, and they've become a lot more of a selling club. Obviously Keita was the first big sale, then Timo Werner moved for €53 million to Chelsea, and since then you've had Upamecano to Bayern for 43 million, Ibrahima Konate 40 million to Liverpool, Dominik Szoboszlai 70 million to Liverpool, Dani Olmo 55 million to Barcelona, Christopher Nkunku 60 million to Chelsea, Xavi Simons 65 million to Spurs, Benjamin Sesko 76 million to Manchester United, and Josko Gvardiol 90 million to Manchester City. Gvardiol is currently Leipzig's most expensive sale, while at the current club Yanti Mende is reportedly the next player who could break the €100 million mark for Leipzig and become their most expensive sale ever. So yeah, Leipzig I think it's safe to say that, yeah, they achieved their goal of becoming a Bundesliga side quicker than they expected. But in terms of actually being a side who, like, they don't really care about winning the title anymore, and they're literally being run like a company now, with the flipping of the assets all over. Obviously, Leipzig are still and will always be a controversial side. Regular protests against them, regular signs saying "fuck RB," which is valid, and obviously they're going to continue to be controversial. I do think every football season needs like a villain. You can make the argument that Bayern are always the villain in the context of the Bundesliga, but in terms of like a true villain that everyone hates, or to take a term from wrestling, a heel, you need Leipzig. Leipzig is that heel, because they're a heel that can actually go on and actually win something, rather than a team who doesn't really challenge a lot. Obviously, a lot of people have said that they are a good proponent for East German football, but they're not an East German side. And I think that's a kind of a dumb argument to make, because it was like East Germany was nearly gone for 30 years or for 20 years by the time they were formed. So I think that's a dumb argument to make. But yeah, obviously everyone hates Leipzig. If you don't hate Leipzig, there's probably something questionable about you. Obviously they've continued to change, and like they have Jurgen Klopp in some sporting sort of role now. And I still do think it's only a matter of time before they win the title. Where they get to win the title, or when they could win it, is yet to be seen, because obviously this goal and way of buying players young and selling them for profit is not a way to win you a title, which most people have seen. So until they take a bit more of a bigger stamp or step to achieve this, and they're probably not going to win the title anytime soon.